Picture this. January 1847, deep in the Colorado Rockies, and Jackson McGraw is about to become either a legend or a corpse. Now, you have to understand something about the American frontier in the 1840s. This wasn't some romantic western where the hero always finds a way. This was a place where nature killed you for making one mistake, and McGraw had just made several. At 31 years old, McGraw was what you might call aggressively stubborn, the kind of man who would argue with a blizzard if he thought it was wrong. He'd spent the better part of a decade learning woodcraft from Delaware tribe members in Pennsylvania, soaking up techniques that had kept people alive for generations. But when he decided to strike out for the Colorado goldfields, he brought with him the European building methods his father had taught him, methods that worked just fine back east, where winters merely inconvenienced you rather than actively plotting your death. The trouble started when 4 feet of wet snow decided to introduce itself to McGraw's traditional log cabin. Now, 4 feet might not sound like much to you sitting in your warm house, but imagine 4 feet of wet snow. We're talking about the weight of a small automobile pressing down on every square foot of your roof. McGraw watched 20 days of back-breaking work collapse in about 20 seconds. The sound, he would later tell people, was like the mountain itself laughing at him. But here's where it gets interesting, and this is where McGraw's story becomes something more than just another tale of frontier hardship. With temperatures dropping to 40 below zero, that's the kind of cold that kills exposed skin in minutes. McGraw faced what psychologists today would call a moment of cognitive dissonance. Everything he thought he knew about building was buried under 4 feet of nature's critique. His hands were already showing the telltale white patches of frostbite. For 3 days, he'd been trying to rebuild using the same methods that had just failed him, because that's what humans do. We double down on what we know, even when what we know is killing us. But on that third night, as McGraw huddled in what remained of his shelter, something clicked. You see, scattered around his collapsed cabin were the dwellings of the local native population. And they were standing. Not just standing, but standing strong, shedding snow like water off a duck's back. Now, McGraw wasn't the first white settler to notice this, but he might have been the first to swallow his pride long enough to actually learn from it. The Delaware techniques he'd learned years earlier came flooding back. Not the exact methods, mind you, because those were designed for eastern forests and different weather patterns, but the underlying principles. The way certain angles shed weight instead of collecting it, how specific tree types responded to stress, the understanding that sometimes the strongest structure isn't the biggest one, but the smartest one. In his desperate state, and desperation is often the mother of innovation, McGraw began combining things that had never been combined before. He took the Delaware understanding of how wood grain and angles could work together, mixed it with Norwegian dovetail joints he'd learned from Scandinavian immigrants, and added his own observations about how the surviving structures around him were actually constructed. What emerged over the next 4 days would later be called the MAD method: materials, angles, dovetailing. But on those 4 days in January 1847, it was simply a freezing man trying not to die. The specific angles: 45 degrees for load-bearing joints, 30 degrees for water runoff. These weren't calculated in some engineering office. They were born from necessity, from a man watching snow slide off certain surfaces while accumulating on others. They came from indigenous wisdom that understood how nature moved, rather than trying to bulldoze through it with brute force, using only fallen timber, because chopping trees in 40 below weather is a good way to lose fingers, and the basic tools he'd managed to salvage. McGraw erected a shelter that would become the prototype for a revolution. 4 days instead of 20, 1 man instead of a crew, and when that structure not only stood but thrived through the rest of what locals called the Winter of the White Death, word began to spread through the scattered trading posts and mining camps. But here's what's really remarkable about McGraw's innovation. It wasn't just about speed, though cutting building time by 80% certainly got people's attention. It was about accessibility. The traditional methods required specific tools, particular skills, and materials that weren't always available on the frontier. McGraw's system could be mastered by anyone willing to understand a few basic principles about how wood wanted to work, rather than forcing it to work against its nature. Think about that for a moment. In a time when a well-built cabin could mean the difference between life and death for an entire family, McGraw had stumbled onto something that could save thousands of lives. But stumbled isn't quite the right word, is it? Because stumbling implies accident, and what McGraw had done was the opposite of accidental. He had observed, adapted, and innovated under pressure that would have crushed most men. He had taken the best of multiple traditions and forged them into something new, something that honored the wisdom of the past while meeting the demands of the present. As spring arrived and travel became possible again, McGraw found himself facing a choice. He could keep his discovery to himself, use it to get ahead in the competitive world of frontier building, or he could share it. What he chose to do next would turn a simple survival story into something that would reshape how America built itself as it expanded westward. The winter of the White Death had nearly killed Jackson McGraw. Instead, it had given birth to something that would revolutionize frontier construction and save countless lives in the process. But first, he had to convince a bunch of skeptical mountain men that everything they thought they knew about building was wrong, and that, well, that's where things get really interesting. The 1848 Mountain Man Rendezvous at Horse Creek was supposed to be just another gathering of trappers, traders, and tall tales. What it became was the stage for one of the most unlikely revolutions in American frontier history. Picture the scene. Hundreds of grizzled mountain men, their beards thick with months of wilderness living, gathered around fires that crackled with the promise of whiskey and competition. These weren't men easily impressed. They'd survived grizzly attacks, Blackfoot raids, and winters that would make a polar bear shiver. They built things the way their fathers had, and their fathers before them, and any newcomer claiming he could do it better had better be prepared to prove it. Enter Jackson McGraw, 32 years old now, and carrying the confidence of a man who'd cheated death and lived to tell about it. But confidence and 2 bits would buy you a cup of coffee. What McGraw needed was credibility, and credibility in this crowd came at the end of an axe handle. The legendary Thomas Ironwood Hartley held court near the largest fire, regaling listeners with stories of cabins he'd built from the Columbia River to the Rio Grande. Hartley was what you might call the gold standard of frontier construction, a man who could fell a tree with surgical precision and raise a cabin that would outlast the mountains themselves. When McGraw approached Hartley's circle and mentioned his new building methods, the reaction was about what you'd expect. Laughter. Deep, belly-shaking laughter that echoed across the creek bottom. "Son," Hartley said, spitting tobacco juice that sizzled in the fire. "I been building since before you could hold an axe. My daddy taught me, his daddy taught him, and his daddy learned from the best Norwegian craftsman who ever crossed the Atlantic. You telling me some greenhorn who near froze to death last winter has figured out something we missed." Now, here's where McGraw could have backed down. Should have backed down, really, because challenging Ironwood Hartley in front of 300 mountain men was like challenging a grizzly to an arm wrestling contest. But McGraw had spent a winter learning that sometimes survival demands abandoning everything you think you know, and he was about to apply that lesson on a much larger scale. "I'm saying," McGraw replied, his voice carrying just far enough for the nearby fires to hear, "that I can build a weatherproof cabin faster than you and any 2 men you choose, using less timber, and it'll stand stronger when we're done." The silence that followed was the kind you hear right before avalanches. Then Hartley stood up, all 6 feet 4 inches of him, and the crowd began to gather like vultures around fresh meat. What happened next became frontier legend, passed down through generations of builders and repeated around campfires from California to Maine. The Great Horse Creek Challenge, they called it, though nobody planned for it to become great. It started with whiskey-fueled boasting and ended up revolutionizing how America built itself. McGraw wagered his entire season's pelts, worth roughly $2,000, which was serious money when a good horse cost $50. Hartley matched the bet and chose his partners. Swedish immigrant Eric Lindqvist, known for his decorative dovetails, and former Yale professor Theodore Morse, who'd headed west after a scandal involving a dean's wife, and had since become as handy with tools as he'd once been with Latin conjugations. The rules were simple enough to satisfy Drunk Mountain. Men. 4 days to build a complete cabin, weatherproof and sturdy enough to survive a frontier winter. Same timber allotment, same basic tools, same plot of ground down by the creek where everyone could watch. While the traditional builders began the time-honored process of selecting massive logs and digging foundations deep enough to anchor a ship, McGraw did something that made the crowd murmur with confusion. He walked through the available timber like a man shopping for vegetables, selecting specific trees with the care of a jeweler choosing diamonds. His assistant in this endeavor was Solomon Rivers, a freed slave from Missouri who'd made his way west after the death of his former master. Rivers had the kind of methodical intelligence that made him perfect for learning McGraw's system, and the physical strength to keep pace with the back-breaking work ahead. What the crowd didn't know was that Rivers would become more than an assistant. He'd become McGraw's first master apprentice, eventually teaching the method to hundreds of others. The native women traders, particularly Sarah Crow, Feather of the Shoshone, provided advice that proved crucial. They understood which trees cut at which times of year would season properly, which species worked best in combination, and how to read the grain for maximum strength. Their knowledge, combined with McGraw's innovations, created something entirely new. Day 1. While Hartley's team hauled logs that required 4 men to move, McGraw and Rivers assembled what looked like a child's toy by comparison. Lodgepole pine for framing, lighter, straighter, easier to work with. Blue spruce for weatherproofing, naturally resistant to moisture and insects. The crowd began to place side bets on whether McGraw's structure would even stand upright. Day 2. The traditional builders had their foundation set and were beginning to raise walls using methods that hadn't changed in centuries. McGraw's team was already framing their roof. The angles looked wrong to experienced eyes. Too steep here, too shallow there. But Sarah Crow Feather nodded approvingly as she watched water from a morning shower run off the emerging structure like it was designed by nature itself. Day 3. Hartley's team was making steady progress, their cabin rising with the solid inevitability of mountains forming. But McGraw's structure was nearly complete, and something strange was happening. The crowd had stopped laughing. Experienced builders were walking closer, studying the joints, testing the stability with their own hands. Day 4. 96 hours after the challenge began, McGraw's cabin stood complete, while the traditional builders were still chinking gaps between their logs. But standing wasn't enough. Both structures had to pass the tests. First, the flood test. They diverted creek water through both cabins, simulating the kind of spring runoff that destroyed so many frontier buildings. Hartley's cabin shed water adequately. McGraw's structure channeled it away so efficiently that the interior stayed bone dry. Then came the buffalo stampede simulation, 20 men with logs, simulating the impact of spooked livestock or falling trees. Hartley's cabin absorbed the blows with solid resilience. McGraw's structure flexed and distributed the force, emerging without a single loosened joint. The crowd's silence spoke louder than cheers. Mary Donaldson, traveling with her family to California, captured the moment in her diary. These men moved like dancers, each knowing their role, timber flying into place as if by magic. What took others days was accomplished in hours. Word spread faster than wildfire through trading posts from Fort Laramie to Santa Fe. By autumn, that word would save lives when early snows trapped the Donaldson family and 39 other settlers in South Pass. McGraw arrived with 7 men trained in his methods, and in 6 days they erected emergency shelters for every family. Not one person died that winter, in a place where such storms typically killed dozens. But the real revolution wasn't just about speed or efficiency, it was about democratizing construction knowledge. McGraw's system could be taught to anyone willing to learn, while traditional methods required years of apprenticeship. In a nation expanding westward at breakneck pace, that difference meant everything. As the rendezvous ended and men scattered to their distant territories, they carried more than memories of the challenge. They carried knowledge that would reshape the American frontier. The impossible had been proven possible, and now everyone wanted to know how. 1849 changed everything. The cry of gold, echoing from California's Sierra Nevada foothills, didn't just bring prospectors, It brought the greatest housing crisis in American history. And Jackson McGraw was about to become the man with the solution. Think about the scale of what happened when James Marshall spotted those shiny flakes in Sutter's Mill. Within months, the population of California exploded from 14,000 to over 300,000 people. 300,000! That's like dropping the entire population of modern-day Pittsburgh into a territory that had barely enough housing for a small town. Every single one of those gold seekers needed a roof over their head, and they needed it yesterday. Traditional building methods simply couldn't keep pace. A skilled crew using conventional techniques might raise one cabin per week if they pushed hard. Do the math. At that rate, housing those 300,000 newcomers would take centuries. People were sleeping in tents through Sierra Nevada winters that killed with casual efficiency. Something had to give, and what gave was the old way of doing things. McGraw arrived in Nevada City in spring of 1849 with Solomon Rivers and a carefully selected team of 12 men. What they found was chaos that would have made Dante weep. Boomtowns sprouting overnight like mushrooms after rain, men paying $50 for the privilege of sleeping on a saloon floor, families huddled in canvas shelters that offered about as much protection as a prayer. But where others saw crisis, McGraw saw opportunity on a scale that would make modern entrepreneurs jealous. He established his first training camp on a hill overlooking Nevada City, and what happened there over the next 6 months was nothing short of revolutionary. Instead of hoarding his methods like trade secrets, McGraw did something that seemed insane to business-minded observers. He taught them to anyone willing to learn. Sarah Crowe Feather had followed the gold rush west, not for precious metal, but for the far more valuable opportunity to bridge two worlds. Her understanding of sustainable building practices, combined with McGraw's innovations, created techniques that worked with California's unique environment rather than against it. She taught builders how to read the land, how certain orientations could capture cooling breezes in summer and block harsh winds in winter. Eric Lindqvist brought his own revolution to the mix. The Swedish immigrant understood that efficiency didn't have to mean ugliness. His decorative elements, carved beam ends, carefully proportioned window frames, elegant roof lines, proved that McGraw's methods could produce buildings that were not just functional, but beautiful. In boomtowns where most structures looked like they'd been assembled by drunken beavers, Lindqvist's touches made mad-built buildings instantly recognizable. Theodore Morse, the former Yale professor, approached the challenge with academic rigor. He documented everything, every technique, every modification, every lesson learned from failure. His detailed manuals became the foundation for training programs that could turn a complete novice into a competent builder in 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Traditional apprenticeships took years. The breakthrough came when McGraw realized that speed wasn't just about individual efficiency, it was about systematic coordination. He developed what modern business schools would recognize as assembly line production, 60 years before Henry Ford made it famous in automobile manufacturing. Teams specialized. Some felled and prepared timber, others focused on joints and connections, still others handled roofing and weatherproofing. Each group mastered their specific tasks to the point where they could work with unconscious precision. When these specialized teams came together, the results bordered on magical. The Great Sacramento Speed Build of 1860 demonstrated this coordination on an unprecedented scale. Picture this. Teams of builders working like components in a vast machine, constructing an entire neighborhood in 30 days, 47 structures housing over 200 families, complete with proper foundations, weatherproofing, and finishing work that would last decades. But 1858 brought McGraw his greatest challenge yet, and it wasn't from nature or competition, it was from lawyers. The Continental Building Company, backed by railroad money and Eastern investors, had been watching McGraw's success with the cold calculation of men who saw profit in everything. They arrived at his Nevada City camp with federal marshals and briefcases full of legal documents, claiming intellectual property theft and demanding royalties for every building constructed using their methods. Now, you have to understand the audacity of this move. These men had never swung a hammer in anger, never spent a winter night wondering if their shelter would hold until morning. never innovated out of desperation in 40 below weather. They were claiming ownership of knowledge born from necessity and shared freely for the benefit of humanity. McGrath's response became the stuff of frontier legend. Instead of hiring lawyers or negotiating in boardrooms, he called a gathering. 300 settlers, builders, and townsfolk assembled in the meadow where he'd first demonstrated his methods. While Continental's representatives read their injunctions and cease and desist orders, McGrath did something that made their legal papers worthless. He taught his entire system publicly, in full view of everyone present. "Knowledge belongs to humanity," he declared, his voice carrying across the meadow, like air and water. "No man can own the wisdom that saves lives, and no company can patent the methods that build communities." For 3 days, McGrath and his master builders demonstrated every technique, explained every principle, answered every question. They taught the MAD method to anyone willing to learn, creating hundreds of new practitioners who could carry the knowledge beyond the reach of any legal claim. The Continental Building Company retreated when territorial judges, MAD, living in MAD-built courthouses, MA, sided overwhelmingly with the settlers. But more importantly, the knowledge was now so widespread that containing it would be like trying to hold back a river with your bare hands. This wasn't just about building techniques anymore, it was about fundamental questions of ownership and innovation in a rapidly expanding nation. Could knowledge born from desperate innovation be claimed by those who'd never faced that desperation? McGrath's answer resonated far beyond the construction industry. The cultural impact proved as significant as the practical innovations. When the Paiute tribe initially resisted the rapid settlement expansion enabled by fast construction, McGrath negotiated something unprecedented: building exchanges. His teams would teach modified MAD techniques that respected sacred spaces and traditional land use patterns, while tribal members shared sustainable practices that had preserved the environment for generations. This cultural fusion created the distinctive Western architectural style still visible today, structures that combined European efficiency with indigenous wisdom and American innovation, buildings that worked with their environment rather than dominating it, that could be constructed quickly but lasted generations. Competition spawned even greater innovation. Other builders, inspired by McGrath's success, developed their own variations and improvements. The friendly rivalry pushed everyone to greater heights, creating a construction boom that helped house America's western expansion. But perhaps the most significant development was the democratization of building knowledge. McGrath's methods didn't require expensive tools or years of training. A farmer could learn them in weeks and build his own home. A shopkeeper could construct his store. Families could house themselves without depending on scarce and expensive professional builders. By 1860, MAD-built structures stretched from the Pacific coast to the Rocky Mountains. Railroad companies adopted industrial-scale versions of McGrath's techniques to build worker towns along their routes. The Transcontinental Railroad's completion owed much to the rapid housing construction that kept workers sheltered and productive in remote locations. The revolution that began with one man's desperate innovation in a Colorado winter had become the foundation of American westward expansion. But McGrath himself remained focused on the human element. Every building was a family protected. Every technique taught was a life potentially saved. The winter of 1867 found Jackson McGrath back where it all began, in that same Colorado cabin where desperation had birthed revolution 20 years earlier. But this wasn't the crude shelter of a freezing man anymore. 2 decades of refinements had transformed it into something approaching architectural poetry. Every beam and joint embodying the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime spent perfecting the art of efficient construction. At 71, McGrath's hands still moved with the confidence of a master craftsman, though they now bore the stories of 1,000 buildings in their scars and calluses. His hair had gone white as mountain snow, but his eyes still held the spark of innovation that had carried him through that first desperate winter. He'd gathered 43 master builders for what he called the Great Teaching, 17 days that would preserve everything he'd learned for future generations. Picture the scene. Men and women who'd spread McGrath's methods across a continent, each bringing their own innovations and improvements, assembled in the cabin where it all started. Solomon Rivers, now 55, and McGraw's equal in all but years, had traveled from his school in Colorado Springs where he taught freed slaves the building trades. Sarah Crowfeather brought representatives from 6 tribes who'd integrated MAD techniques with traditional practices. Eric Lindqvist arrived from San Francisco, where his architectural firm was designing the grand buildings of a growing city. Theodore Morse came from his position as territorial building inspector, his manuals now standard texts in trade schools across the West. For 17 days, McGraw shared not just techniques but philosophy. This wasn't merely about construction anymore. It was about the relationship between human innovation and human need, about how efficiency could serve humanity rather than merely enriching those who controlled it. Every building, McGraw told his assembled disciples, is a promise that someone will be warm when winter comes, dry when storms rage, safe when danger threatens. We don't build for ourselves. We build for the families who'll call these places home long after we're gone. Solomon Rivers transcribed every word, creating what became known as the definitive MAD manual. But more than preserving techniques, these documents captured McGraw's fundamental insight, that true innovation comes not from imposing human will upon nature, but from understanding how to work in harmony with natural forces. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present that McGraw spent his final winter perfecting the very cabin where he'd nearly died 20 years earlier. Every modification told a story, the slight adjustment to roof angle that shed snow more efficiently, the new joint design that distributed weight even better, the ventilation system that prevented the moisture buildup that rotted so many frontier buildings. Spring brought news that would test everything McGraw had built, both literally and figuratively. A massive late-season blizzard trapped hundreds of families across Colorado and Wyoming, the kind of storm that traditionally killed dozens. But this wasn't 1847 anymore. Communities using MAD methods reported casualty rates 90% lower than traditional settlements. Buildings that might have collapsed under conventional construction stood firm. Families that could have been erected in days survived where others perished. McGraw himself died as he'd lived, building. The schoolhouse for former slave children in Colorado Springs was to be his masterpiece, embodying everything he believed about construction serving humanity. Solomon Rivers would later write that McGraw spent his final morning adjusting the window placement to maximize natural light for reading, ensuring the structure would nurture young minds as effectively as it sheltered young bodies. He collapsed while setting the final roof beam, his heart giving out after 7 decades of pushing human limitations. But even in death, McGraw demonstrated his principles. He designed the building so that any competent carpenter could complete it from his detailed plans. The schoolhouse opened that fall, exactly as he'd envisioned. The harsh winter of 1871 provided the ultimate test of McGraw's legacy. Across the West, communities faced storms that would have devastated earlier generations of settlers. Railroad construction camps weathered blizzards that would have halted progress for months under traditional building methods. Mining towns survived avalanche conditions that had previously meant evacuation or death. The statistics tell the story with brutal clarity. Settlements using MAD techniques reported weather-related casualties at rates barely 1/10 those of traditionally built communities. Families stayed warm, dry, and alive in structures that could be erected in days rather than weeks. The democratization of building knowledge that McGraw had fought for meant that survival no longer depended on finding and affording skilled craftsmen. Railroad companies had adopted industrial-scale versions of McGraw's methods, building worker towns from Chicago to San Francisco with unprecedented speed and efficiency. The Transcontinental Railroad's completion in 1869 owed much to rapid housing construction that kept workers productive in remote locations. What had begun as one man's desperate innovation had become the foundation of America's westward expansion. But perhaps McGraw's greatest legacy lay not in the buildings themselves, but in the democratization of knowledge he'd championed. Modern analysis reveals the true genius of his approach. Those angles he'd discovered through desperation matched optimal physics calculations that computers would confirm a century later. His material selection principles anticipated sustainable building practices by generations. His understanding of efficiency, serving humanity rather than profit, anticipated management theories that wouldn't emerge until the 20th century. The Timber Heritage Foundation maintains 17 original McGrath structures today, including that first desperate shelter, now a national landmark. Visitors can see the evolution of technique across 2 decades, each building representing another step in the refinement of revolutionary methods. Master Carpenter Maria Santos represents the living legacy of McGraw's teachings. Her great-great-grandfather learned directly from Solomon Rivers, and she still teaches pure MAD techniques at workshops across the country. Every beam we place, she tells her students, carries the wisdom of a man who turned desperation into innovation, saving lives across generations. The methods that Jackson McGraw developed during those 4 desperate days in 1847 continue to influence construction today. Sustainable builders study his material selection principles. Engineers marvel at joint designs that distribute stress with mathematical precision. Architects incorporate his understanding that buildings should work with their environment rather than against it. But beyond the technical innovations, McGraw's greatest contribution may have been his insistence that knowledge belongs to humanity. In an age when information is increasingly controlled and monetized, his example reminds us that the most important discoveries often come from those facing desperate circumstances, and that sharing such knowledge freely serves humanity better than any profit motive. The man who nearly froze to death in a Colorado winter went on to save thousands of lives and transform how America built itself. His legacy lives on in every efficiently constructed building, every family kept safe by thoughtful design, every person who understands that true innovation comes not from dominating nature, but from learning to work in harmony with it. Jackson McGraw's revolution began with 4 feet of snow and 40 below temperatures. It ended with a continent built on the foundation of shared knowledge, human ingenuity, and the understanding that sometimes the greatest innovations come from the most desperate moments. In the end, perhaps that's the most human legacy of all.